in hindsight now, my guess is you'll find something in that moved you somewhere in your life, either deeper or to a new opening. As a door shuts, a window may open. It may be locked and bolted and take a while to get it open, but that pathway. So that's what I'm talking about. That's a lot of what death provides for me. The transformation is amazing. I'd like to share an example with you, a poignant one, of a death experience that helps that the family and the person that was dying transcended their fears and transformed life. This is a work I had the honor of doing with a 90-year-old Holocaust survivor a few years ago. Her name is Lori, and with her 2 adult daughters. I'm going to read you a little memoir I wrote on it, if I might. I'd spent more than 18 months working with a venerated Holocaust survivor, mother and grandmother, therapeutically focusing on her terrors of the Holocaust and her severe fear of death. Up until this time in her life, she had never spoken much about her pain, her loss, and her suffering that resulted from being in a concentration camp, separated from her family at a very young age. As time passed, in our many sessions, she began to remember memories that she had never remembered before through the traumatic experiences in her mind. She courageously faced the fears she could recall about the Holocaust and death. However, her daughter, as we neared the mother's death, became more frightened and more anxious about her mother's imminent passing. She wept. "I don't want to be near her when she dies. I can't handle this." The eldest daughter shared that she was unable to be present for her father some years before when he died. She had never been near death and reported that she became physically ill at the thought of being close to death, let alone her mother's death. When her mother was in her final hours of her life, I asked both her daughters if they desired to be present at their mother's death. They were both exhausted, physically and emotionally, from hours and hours and days of support and love and nurturing. They decided to leave. They said their goodbyes at about midnight and silently left their mother's side. I stayed for a bit. Sometimes when loved ones leave the room, the person that's on their path to death chooses to die. They choose often not to die when a loved one's in the room. It's kind of what they think the final gift is. And many will say, "I didn't want to see that image and I didn't want to leave that image." Personally, the image is beautiful. I stayed for a while and I read her stories from a beautiful, sweet book called Graceful Passages. It's out on the table there if you want to peek at it. It's a book I use with all my clients. It's got CDs with music in it, and it's beautiful stories and encouragements and a little bit of a hand-holding on this journey. I read some poems to her. I gently kissed her goodbye, this matriarch goodbye, and I too headed home to rest as I knew death was near. As I prepared for bed, laid my head on the pillow, the phone rang. Lori had taken her last breath. Directly, I headed back to her home and began the rituals of honoring her transition. Both daughters appeared. With the eldest standing at the door, we embraced and slipped into silence, tears, and reverence. After a brief time, I asked permission to start the end-of-life rituals. The youngest daughter did not show any signs of fears. Her fearlessness became evident as she joined me in the end-of-life rituals of her mother, of bathing, anointing, adorning, and dressing her mother for final dispensation or burial. I inquired if the eldest daughter wished to be present or to wait for us in the living room. I placed a chair halfway into the room and halfway out into the hall. She chose to sit in the chair at the edge of the room. She had chosen to sit at the thresholds of her emotions. For the next 2.5 hours, the youngest daughter and I bathed and anointed her body with lavender oil, dressed her, adorned her with jewels and flowers, brushed her hair, loved her, wept, told stories, played music. The eldest daughter, still sitting at the edge of the room, held tightly to her mother's socks as we worked. I waited till the rituals were completed, and then I tenderly reached out my hand for the socks. She held those socks ever so tightly near her heart and said, "I would like to place these socks on my mother." My breath escaped as I understood what an unfathomable transition this was for her. Tears flowed down all our cheeks. 2 months after we buried this beautiful woman, the eldest daughter shared being present at the end of life rituals, touching her mother literally in death and her fears of death. Life became ever so immediate and precious to her. She also shared the peacefulness she felt and the positive changes that she had begun to make in her life since her mother's death. This was something that she was unable to accomplish before her mother's death experience. She touched death. She smelled death. She heard death, literally, emotionally, and spiritually, and transcended death back into a more meaningful life for herself. This story is a tangible example of my position and absence, such a visceral and present experience of death. The contemporary attitude about the denial of death has evolved past the ideology of denial towards an attitude of almost invisible death. Much like the eldest daughter, many just avoid facing the issue of mortality by running from it both mentally and physically. These avoidant behaviors and thought patterns make it really difficult, if not impossible, to find meaning in death, and I contend in life. What have I derived from all these years of being a death doula? After many years, a doctorate degree in mythology and depth psychology focusing on death, dying, and beyond of cultural mythologies from around the world, world religions, and comparative literature, I have proud to say that I have not developed an ideology yet. And may I never. I personally think that's the challenge right now. We've put death in a box with a ribbon on it. It's not boxable. It's not boxable. Now, I want to enter a little bit into the medicalization of death. Excuse me one second. Which is our current myth, our current living myth of death, and it is our current ideology of death. Before I say another word about it, I want you to hear loud and clear that I'm not opposed to the medicalization of death. It's very necessary. But if we do the old pie adage, it's just a piece of the pie. But it's necessary in many ways. We've created a monolithic, almost one-dimensional approach to death, focused on medication, money, and an egoic aspects of dying and death. Psyche and soul are not considered. This is why the Heart Way does not charge for end-of-life services and will never if I'm still here to do that. I don't believe money belongs in this sacred time of life. It's oxymoronic to the experience. That's the last thing. the last thing that I want a family or a loved one to worry about. How are they going to pay me? Sometimes I'm there for hours and days. You can't put a dollar amount on it. Hence, nonprofit and the generosity of the community and 80 hours of work a week to help me to move this mission forward and support. Let me say just a little bit more about the medicalization of death, if I might. I believe there's a lot of hindering in the medicalization of death. My dissertation thesis was Death Beyond Denial. That's that small little book out there. I'm not ready to separate with it. I just completed it this year. So, I talk a lot about, in Death Beyond Denial, the medicalization of death. So I'm just going to scratch the surface here for you a little bit. But I think it really does hurt our transformational opportunities in death when we highly medicalize death. The list is huge. I'll just speak to a couple points of it. And one of the points that is huge for me is actually the overuse of drugs at the end of life. Now, we have the gambit of humans that, in fact, one person in the room always shares with me, give me the magic bullet. And the magic bullet is, I don't want to be conscious, I don't want any pain, no problem whatsoever. And then you have everything in between on the other spectrum, like me, who doesn't want to miss a minute. Are you kidding? I've spent my life on this work. I don't want to miss a minute of this. And I may ask for that drug when I need it as well. Nobody knows the journey. And in conversation as I was preparing to share with you today, a beautiful person in my life said to me, you know what you do, Andrea? And I said, no, tell me. And he said, you allow. And that just sunk, allow. Why do I need to allow? Nobody needs my permission. But it really is about allowing us to enter that sacred space, whatever that is for us, because we have so many worries. Should we? Could we? What about this? What about that? And when we drop into our own mythology, if you will, we're going to be more freed to be present. So it doesn't matter if someone wants lots of drugs or not. To me, what matters is nurturing and cultivating what that experience desires for the person. And it may change in the middle of the action, and that's okay. Nothing is nailed. The coffin is not nailed down, pun intended. Okay. So having those options are important. And currently, we're not given as many of those options. We medicate for emotions. We medicate for pain, thank goodness, and we medicate for death. Uh-oh. Dying is not painful. Cancer is painful. A broken bone is painful. Those are painful. Taking our last breath is coming in for landing. It's an exhalation. But because of our anxiety and our fears, we medicate that. The conversations are not happening. That's what I do as a death doula, is have those conversations so that we can feel our way through. Okay. I also want to go back to Lori for a minute and share with you another aspect of the medicalization, how much it interfered with the experience for the family. I was with her for 18 months, as I shared, working on many levels. So we're about 2-3 weeks away from her death, which I did not know at that particular moment in time, of course. P.S. Nobody can call death, by the way. Come close. I can come close, but it's still a mystery. So Lori's pain was elevating. Pain was out of control. Her breathing became very, very labored, and she ended up in the emergency room. The daughter called me. I'm on my way to the ER. I met him in the ER. They did their investigation. They did their labs. They did their x-rays and came up with nothing. This was